Alissa Guernsey was born into a world filled with love and warmth. Her parents adored her, and though life was not always easy, she was surrounded by people who cared for her. She had bright eyes, a sweet smile, and a giggle that could light up any room. Her family saw her as a blessing, a tiny bundle of joy who had her whole life ahead of her. But the happiness that filled her early days would not last. Tragedy struck when Alissa was still just a baby. Her father, the man who had loved and protected her, passed away suddenly. His death shattered the family, leaving her mother in a state of deep grief and overwhelming stress. The once stable home they had built was now fragile, held together only by a mother struggling to cope with an unbearable loss. She did everything she could to provide for her children, but the weight of single parenthood, combined with financial struggles, soon became too much. As months passed, Alissa's mother faced an impossible choice. She needed help, and in her vulnerable state, she turned to someone she believed she could trust. The decision to temporarily place Alissa with a family member was made out of desperation, not neglect. It was meant to be a solution, a way to ensure her daughter was cared for while she regained stability. The arrangement was supposed to be temporary, just until things improved. But this choice would unknowingly seal Alissa's fate. The woman who took custody of Alissa presented herself as a caring and responsible figure. To the outside world, she was someone who could provide stability and structure. She reassured everyone that Alissa would be safe, loved, and well taken care of. Social workers and authorities saw no reason to question her. On paper, she seemed like the perfect guardian. At first, everything seemed fine. Alissa was placed in the new home, surrounded by familiar faces. But slowly, things began to change. The love and care she had once known were replaced with something far darker. The warm embrace of family was gone, and in its place was cold indifference. The caregiver, who was supposed to protect her, saw her as a burden instead of a child in need. The warning signs were there from the beginning. Alissa, once a happy and energetic toddler, became withdrawn. Her bright smile faded. Her once playful nature disappeared. She no longer laughed the way she used to, and the sparkle in her eyes dimmed. Neighbors occasionally noticed small bruises on her tiny arms and legs, but they were always explained away with simple excuses. She had fallen, she was clumsy, she was just an active child. No one questioned it, not at first. Despite the changes in Alissa's demeanor, no alarm bells rang. She was still so young, unable to speak for herself, unable to tell anyone the horrors that were unfolding behind closed doors. The system had placed her in a home where she was supposed to be safe, yet no one truly saw her suffering. What should have been a temporary arrangement turned into a death sentence. The home where Alissa was placed was supposed to be a safe haven, but it quickly became a place of suffering. From the outside, everything appeared normal. The foster mother carried on as if she was providing care and protection, deceiving everyone around her. She knew how to present herself as a responsible guardian, saying all the right things when social workers visited. But behind closed doors, Alissa's reality was entirely different. It started subtly. Small moments of neglect, missed meals, cold stares, a lack of comfort when she cried. At first, it might not have seemed like abuse, just a caregiver who was inattentive or overwhelmed. But as time went on, the mistreatment escalated. Alissa was no longer seen as a child in need of love. She was treated as a burden, an inconvenience that needed to be controlled rather than cared for. The bruises started appearing more frequently. At first they were small, faint marks on her arms and legs. Whenever anyone asked about them, the explanations were always the same. She had fallen while playing. She had bumped into furniture. She was clumsy. These excuses were accepted without question. After all, toddlers do fall. But Alissa's injuries were different. They were not the kind of scrapes and bruises a normal child might get. They were deeper, more severe. Some of them were in places that did not make sense for an accidental fall. Alissa's behavior also began to change. She no longer acted like the curious, energetic toddler she once was. Instead, she became quiet, fearful, and withdrawn. She flinched at sudden movements. She avoided eye contact. She no longer reached out for hugs or affection. It was as if she had learned that love and kindness would not come, no matter how much she longed for them. There were times when neighbors heard muffled crying, but it never lasted long. It would start suddenly, a desperate wail from inside the house, but then it would stop just as quickly. Perhaps they assumed the child was being comforted. No one imagined that the silence was not from soothing words or gentle care, but from something much darker. Medical visits should have been a turning point. Doctors noticed that Alissa was not growing as she should. She was underweight, pale, and showed signs of neglect. But when questions were asked, the foster mother always had an answer. She blamed Alissa's poor appetite, claimed she was a fussy eater. She insisted that she was doing everything she could. And just like that, the concerns were dismissed. No one dug deeper. No one investigated further. The system had placed Alissa in this home, and they trusted that she was safe. But in reality, she was trapped. Every moment of her short life was a battle for survival, a constant cycle of fear, pain, and neglect. Each day that passed was another missed opportunity for someone to save her. The signs were there, the warnings were clear, but no one was listening. Alissa's world grew darker. With each passing day, the bruises on her tiny body multiplied, the signs of neglect becoming impossible to ignore. She no longer played, no longer laughed, no longer reached out for comfort. The light inside her had dimmed, replaced by a quiet, haunting sadness that no child should ever have to endure. She was only 16 months old, yet she had already learned that crying would not bring help, that pain was a part of her everyday existence. The abuse was not just physical, it was emotional, psychological. She was treated as if she did not matter, as if she were invisible. The foster mother barely acknowledged her, except when she was punishing her. Alissa was often left alone for hours, isolated, with no one to hold her, no one to reassure her that she was loved. She was not a child being cared for. She was a burden being tolerated. People around her began to notice changes, but no one took action. Family members saw that she looked weaker, her eyes vacant, her small body covered in bruises that could no longer be explained away as simple accidents. Her once chubby cheeks were now sunken, her skin pale. She had stopped reacting to the world around her, as if she had accepted that nothing would change. She had stopped trying to fight back. Medical professionals should have seen the truth. During a routine visit, a doctor noticed that Alissa had suffered a head injury. Her skull showed signs of trauma, something that could not have come from an innocent fall. But again, the foster mother had an excuse. She claimed that Alissa had fallen backward while playing, hitting her head on the floor, and once again, her story was accepted without question. No one investigated further. No one demanded answers. Alissa's condition continued to deteriorate. Her weight dropped even more, and she was no longer meeting developmental milestones. She should have been walking steadily, exploring the world with curiosity. Instead, she barely moved, barely reacted. Her body was failing, her spirit already broken. Neighbors who had once heard her cries now noticed something even more chilling: the silence. The house was no longer filled with the sounds of a playful toddler. Instead, there was an eerie stillness, as if the life inside had been drained away. The few times people saw Alissa outside, she looked different, distant, hollow. She did not reach for toys, did not babble like other toddlers her age. She only clung to herself, as if bracing for whatever pain might come next. Every sign of abuse was there, every warning flag raised. The system had multiple chances to intervene, but it failed her over and over again. Alissa had been placed in this home to be protected, but instead, she had been abandoned by everyone who was supposed to help her. She had no way to ask for help, no words to describe her suffering. All she could do was endure. But her tiny body could only take so much, and soon the abuse would reach its horrifying climax. On the morning of her final day, Alissa Guernsey's body was already weak from months of neglect and abuse. She had little energy left, her fragile frame struggling to keep going. Her once bright eyes had lost their light completely. She no longer cried like she used to. Perhaps she had learned that no one would come, no one would save her. But the nightmare was not over yet. The worst was still to come. At some point that day, Alissa suffered another violent beating. The cool foster mother who was supposed to protect her became the very person who ended her life. The exact details of what happened in those final moments may never be fully known, but the injuries on Alissa's body told a horrific story. Her head was struck with such force that her small skull could not withstand the trauma. The impact was brutal, causing severe swelling and bleeding inside her brain. This was not an accident. This was not a simple fall. This was an act of pure violence inflicted upon a defenseless child. When emergency responders were finally called, it was already too late. Alissa's tiny body lay lifeless, her face swollen and bruised. Her skin, once soft and full of life, was now marked with evidence of months of suffering. She had endured so much in her short time on this earth, but in the end her body could not fight anymore. The abuse had taken everything from her. The foster mother's explanation was the same as always. Alissa had fallen, she had hit her head. It was all just a tragic accident. But this time, the truth could not be ignored. Medical examiners quickly determined that her injuries were not consistent with a simple fall. The bruises, the swelling, the internal damage. It was all evidence of prolonged abuse. Someone had hurt her. Someone had taken her life. As the investigation unfolded, the horrors of Alissa's final months became clearer. The bruises on her body were in various stages of healing, meaning they had been inflicted over time. Her weight loss indicated severe neglect, a lack of proper nutrition and care. The head trauma she suffered was not from a single incident, but the result of repeated blows. She had been living in pain, day after day, with no one to protect her. The community was shaken by the news of her death. People who had seen Alissa in the months leading up to that day realized too late that the signs had been there all along. The neighbors who had heard her cries, the doctors who had noticed her weight loss, the social workers who had visited but never dug deeper. So many chances to save her had been missed. So many people had failed her. Alissa's story was no longer just about a child who had been abused. It was about a system that had allowed it to happen. She had been placed in a home meant to protect her, yet she had suffered until her very last breath. The truth was undeniable now, and justice had to be served. But as the legal process began, many wondered, would justice for Alissa truly be enough? Or was it already too late? Alissa Guernsey's death sent shockwaves through the community. A little girl, just 16 months old, had been brutally abused and left to suffer in a place where she was supposed to be safe. Her tragic story was no longer hidden behind closed doors. It was now in the hands of investigators, medical examiners, and prosecutors who had to piece together the horrors she had endured. The autopsy results were damning. Alissa's body told a story of prolonged abuse. Multiple bruises in various stages of healing covered her skin. Her skull had suffered a fatal blow. But there were also previous injuries, evidence that this was not the first time she had been hurt. Her small frame was underweight, showing signs of malnutrition. She had been neglected, starved, beaten. The official cause of death was blunt force trauma to the head. The manner of death was ruled a homicide. The foster mother, who had been responsible for Alissa's care, was arrested. She continued to insist that Alissa's injuries were accidental, that she had simply fallen. But the medical evidence proved otherwise. Her explanations no longer held up under scrutiny. Investigators discovered that she had never truly cared for Alissa. She had treated her with cruelty, punishing her for things a baby could not even understand. Witnesses began coming forward, describing how Alissa had changed in the months after being placed in that home, how she had gone from a happy, lively child to a silent, fearful one. The trial was supposed to bring justice, but for many, it felt like justice could never be enough. Alissa had suffered for months, and now the world knew the truth. People demanded answers. How had this happened? Why hadn't the system protected her? There had been so many warning signs. Why had no one stepped in before it was too late? When the foster mother was sentenced, there was outrage. Many believed the punishment did not fit the crime. The system had failed Alissa once by placing her in that home, and now it had failed her again by not delivering the justice she deserved. But no sentence could bring her back. No courtroom decision could erase the suffering she endured. In the wake of Alissa's death, the community mourned. Her family grieved not just for her loss, but for the life she never got to live. People who had once ignored the warning signs now lived with guilt, wondering if they could have done something differently. Advocacy groups began pushing for reforms, demanding better protection for children in foster care. Alissa's story became a symbol of a broken system, a painful reminder of what happens when people turn a blind eye to abuse. Her name would not be forgotten. Though she was gone, her story sparked a conversation, forcing people to look closer, to ask more questions, to listen when a child's silent suffering goes unnoticed. But for Alissa, change had come too late. Her life had been stolen from her, before it had truly begun. And all that remained was the question that haunted everyone who heard her story. Why did no one save her?